We'll now take a look at how we would handle the constructors of both the superclass and the subclass. So remember that a subclass can have its own data members, right? So this does mean that a subclass can have its own private data members. Well, if we have our own private data members, we need a way to initialize those. So that means that our subclass can also have its own constructors. But wait a minute, if we have our own constructor for the subclass, we need to be able to initialize the data members of the superclass as well, right? So how do we initialize those data members? Because once again, we can't directly access those data members. Well, just as we had methods that would call the corresponding superclass methods, we would need to call the constructor of the superclass. Well, how do we do that? You might think, well, let's just put in the name of the class and some parentheses, then pass anything we need to initialize and we're good to go, right? But that's not true, because if you remember from CS121, we're not allowed to directly call the constructor. But here I'm saying we need to call the constructor. So how do we do that? Well, it's really simple. All we have to do is just call super with the parentheses. That's it. That tells us that we are calling the constructor of the superclass. So whenever we inherit something, super here is basically corresponding to the constructor of the superclass. So our format here would be super, a pair of parentheses, and then any parameters that would go inside the constructor. So if we were to pass any parameters to the constructor of the superclass, we would include those as well. Now we do need to mention that whenever we're defining the constructor of a subclass, we have to call the super constructor first. You can't save it for the end. So we have to initialize the data members of the superclass first, then we can initialize the data members of the subclass. Let's take a look at an example of the constructors for the box class. So remember, the box class is inheriting from the rectangle class. So we have the length and the width as private data members for the rectangle class, and we have the height as a private data member for the box class. So we have our default constructor first, this public box. So notice that the first line here is we are calling the default constructor of the rectangle class. So we have this super right here. So that just simply calls the default constructor of the rectangle class. So I'm going to guess that is going to set the length and the width to 0. And then the next line, the height is being initialized to 0. And then our second constructor has parameters for the length, the width, and the height. So our first line is we're going to call the corresponding constructor in the rectangle class. So we're going to assume that that constructor does exist. But we're going to call the rectangle constructor here and pass the length and width parameters, which would set the value of length and width. So here, even though I said length and width, that means L and W, but we're going to set our length data member to L and our width data member to W. And then finally, we're going to set our height data member to H. And just a couple quick notes about using the constructors in our subclass and superclass. So the first note that we should keep in mind is that if we don't include super, if we don't include a call to the superclass constructor, the default constructor of the superclass will be called. So in our previous example, if we didn't include the call to super, the default constructor would be fine because we're calling the default constructor, but our constructor with parameters, it would call the default constructor by default. So we usually want to keep a good habit of just calling the constructor that we want. So if we have the constructor with parameters, call the corresponding superclass constructor with parameters. The other thing that we should note, and I've already alluded to this earlier, is if we try to invoke a superclass's constructor by using the name of the class. So in our subclass, if we try to do rectangle with parentheses in our earlier example, we're going to get a syntax error. So we cannot use this rectangle constructor in the box subclass. We have to use super with the parentheses.